All right, so this week we are on chapter 9. So we're over halfway done. There's 14 weeks in this course. So counting this week, there's 6 more to go. So we're going to talk about more things about experiments later. Before we get into anything, this is kind of just a kind of updates about where we're at in the course and what to do. So this coming Sunday, March 27th, chapter 9 Smart Book is due, and then also quiz 4. So quiz 4, just so you know, is going to cover chapters 7, 8, and 9. So that's basically everything that we've covered since the first exam. And so it's one chapter about survey research and then 2 about experiments. This is the second one that's focused on experiments. Chapter 8, right before break, we talked about experiments. Next week there's going to be a really short Smart Book assignment due. So we're kind of not cover chapter 10 in super detail. Chapter 10 is about complex experimental designs, and sort of in my general opinion, like goes beyond the scope of what you really need to know about experiments. So next week in class, we're going to do some more sort of activities about experiments, and we'll cover some aspects of chapter 10, but like I said, it'll be shorter than most. And also importantly, the third writing assignment is due next Sunday. So let's talk through that. So if you go on Blackboard, and everything is in this contact folder always. And then, so for assignment 3, there's a folder that has all the sort of important things. So basically, you're going to use this link to turn in the assignment. You don't really need to use it until you have completed it, but then this is what you want to download first. So this is the instructions for this assignment. Basically, what you're also going to do is download, you can download both these articles and choose between them, but so the purpose of this assignment is an article review. So you're going to sort of carefully review one of these 2 articles. I'll just sort of, for the sake of showing what they're about, click on them real quick. So this is the one that I called the clinical article, published in Computers and Human Behavior, which is a journal that publishes sort of a variety of things. It's kind of a clinical article. It's kind of just, the reason I call it clinical is because it has to do with symptoms of depression and anxiety. But the article is basically about how social media use predicts symptoms of depression and anxiety. So that's one of the options. And then the other option is, I'm calling it an IO article for industrial organizational. It's also kind of a personality article. So it's about personality traits and academic exam performance. In IO psychology, we kind of are often interested in studying like things that predict performance. Typically, it's more so like work performance, but school performance is also sort of often an outcome. So those are the 2 options. Basically, you'll choose between one of them, and then go through like each sort of question on this assignment and answer it thoroughly. The key is sort of you have to read the article thoroughly to be able to answer a lot of the questions. And I would say, as a general tip, like before you get into going through each question in order, I would suggest sort of skimming over the whole article and just sort of seeing what's covered, seeing how long it is, sort of what is in each section. Both of these articles follow pretty typical sort of formatting, and that there's like an intro, there's a method section, results, and discussion. So I kind of also provided hints for each set of questions about where you can find the information relevant to answering them within the article. These are just sort of general hints, and ultimately you kind of have to go through and find it yourself. But basically, yeah, so you can just use this, you can turn in this document, just save a new version of it with like your name or something. Probably most people's total reviews will be somewhere between 3 to 6 pages. And that's after you've deleted like each of the question stems. So what I said to do here for this second point is that each section should be labeled as below. So like, don't delete these numbers and the letters too. Otherwise we'll have a really hard time grading. But you can delete, like, after you've typed out the answer, the study's main purpose was whatever, blah, 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 blah. You can delete this part of it and then just leave your responses, if that makes sense. I think general tips would be that, yeah, you should use complete sentences each time. And then before you turn it in, you should always proofread at least once going through your responses and just trying to make sure everything is kind of proper grammar and makes sense. Really importantly, this is an independent work assignment. So it's important that you do it independently and also that you put everything in your own words. So part of this does ask for very specific questions from the article. So if you're going to use a quote from the article, you just got to make sure that you're actually quoting it and including a page number. But generally speaking, like, I don't really want you to use quotes. I want you to paraphrase from the article. So paraphrasing just means sort of summarizing in your own words the information that's in the article. And I think that's all I'd say. Like the general stuff, I'll just kind of go through these different sort of sections and just sort of tell you a little bit about them. But the first one is just, you have to provide a reference in APA style. And so I included a link to explain APA style. You can also just Google APA style. Will be many websites that sort of show up that could help you. There's a question about the study design, which I deleted. But basically your job is to report the study's main purpose. Was it correlational or an experiment? Was it quantitative or qualitative? Again, kind of explaining why for each of these things. And these are just kind of really designed to check that you've been paying attention in class and that you understand sort of how to apply what we've learned in class to real articles. There's some questions about the variables where you just basically have to identify and then define them in some cases. So I made notes here that, so you're asked to define the variables that are the primary focus. And if the authors don't define them in the actual article, just you can Google article or Google definitions. So you'll have to identify the hypotheses for the study. Both of these articles do have hypotheses. And here I said it's okay to use the exact wording. You'll have to kind of report some information about the participants and how they were sampled. What did the participants actually do in the study? So what was the procedure? Getting back into variables, like the previous sort of questions were more about like just what are they and what are their definitions in sort of like a language sense, like how do you define something in a dictionary, where this is sort of how do you operationally define variables. So that's how are the variables actually measured in the study. Then you'll have to go through the result and list whether the hypotheses were supported or not. Here's a question that asks about causality. So we've talked about causality a lot in the past few weeks, and how certain research methods, in particular experiments, are really the only thing that you can do to really infer causality. Other sorts of research methods like surveys or archival research can sometimes suggest that there might be causality, but those research methods alone typically sort of you can't know for sure that one variable is causing another just because the two variables are correlated. Like there might be third variables that are causing it. It could be the case that the variable that you think of as the outcome is actually causing changes in the predictor variable. So again, the only way to really control for that is to set up an experiment. Conclusions, just basically kind of, you have to sort of think about the big picture in the study and sort of your own ideas for related studies. And then a few questions at the very end that are ask you sort of critique the actual article. So these are really kind of like applied questions, again, trying to get you to apply some things that we learn in class to these articles. Are there any questions about that assignment? So it's due next Sunday, like 12 days from today. All right. One other update. So the attendance grades through week 8 were posted to Compass over spring break sometime. They're posted like in a percentage out of, so it's actually, it looks like it's sort of eating up more of your grade than it actually is because it's a percent that you're seeing. But basically there have been 8 classes, and what you're seeing is like what percent out of those 8 that you were recorded as being present and responding to the poll. So if you had like an 85, that means you got 7 out of 8. If you had a 71%, that means you got 6 out of 8. If you had 100, that means you were 8 out of 8. Definitely email me if you have questions about the attendance. I guess one thing I'll say just before that is the reason for using the polls to take attendance is that like it does, in my opinion, like to actually get full participation points in this class, like you have to actually be paying attention during class, and at a sort of minimum, like that would mean that you respond to the poll and that you're not just having the Zoom on for the 80 minutes, but you're also actively looking at the screen and identify the poll and respond to it, which is a pretty low bar, I would say, overall for participation. And part of it is like really like we're only meeting once a week out of the 2 times that we're sort of assigned. And so I don't think it's much to ask to sort of say that, yeah, you have to sort of set up a way that you're able to pay attention. And I think I will also say like the vast majority of people are doing a really good job of that. And I'm really kind of only talking to a few people who maybe don't do the best job of that. So anyway, that's why part of the reason we have the polls at sort of different times each week. And some weeks we'll have 2 polls. But really, I just want to make sure that like the attendance grade fairly reflects people who are actually coming and paying attention versus people sort of trying to do the minimum and just kind of get the grade. So that's all I have to say about that. More than I wanted to say, I guess. So, but don't hesitate to email me if you think something is off with your participation grade. I'm happy to look at it and double check. Okay, so getting into some quick review, just to situate where we are. We covered these observational research methods. In week 6 and 7, surveys were part of that. Really the one thing that makes all these methods similar is that there's no sort of manipulations. So we're studying things about people as they're sort of happening. In surveys, we're asking people things about themselves, but there's typically not a manipulation. Otherwise, it would be called an experiment. So this is relevant to that question on the writing assignment that we talked about, but basically, if the article that you review is one of these research methods or a combination of them, it's not going to be enough alone to infer causality. It can suggest it, like I said. But to test causality, we have to set up an experiment. And so experiments, again, are research methods in which there's a manipulated variable, and we manipulate that variable to study its like cause and effect. So whether or not changes in one variable lead to changes in another variable. The variable that we manipulate, we call the independent variable. And then the outcome variable is the dependent variable, and it's think dependent because it's dependent on the independent one. And then we talked about this term true experiments, which basically just means that it's an experiment that's set up where there's random assignment into groups, and that controls effectively for differences between groups. So if I randomly assign enough people, like the two groups are going to be equal on sort of everything except whatever experimental manipulation that we have. And as a result, that means that these sort of designs have the highest degree of internal validity, which we've talked about lots of different types of validity. This internal validity is most relevant to experiments because it concerns whether or not you can make valid inferences about cause and effect from a study. So internal validity has to do with, inferring causality and whether or not we can do that accurately or not. This is all the stuff that we're going to cover in week 9 here. So this is chapter 9, but it's really just kind of various considerations, like if you were to go about planning an experiment, things that you would need to think about, different ways that we can measure variables, other things in terms of like how participants and experimenters, their expectations can sometimes influence the results in ways that we don't want. So we'll get into that. I think actually before we do, let's do a quick poll. So 4 questions. All right, still waiting on 7 people. I'll give 30 more seconds. 6 people, 5 people, 4 people. Three people, 2 people. All right, 10 more seconds. 1 more person. All right, we got everyone. Let's share these results here so everyone should be able to see it. How was your spring break? Oh, poor 2 people had a bad spring break. There was 1 person in the previous class too. But it looks like most people, great or good. That's good. I had a good break too. Definitely got some rest. And I watched a lot of basketball this past week. For those who don't know, this is the NCAA basketball tournament time. And actually, University of Houston has another really good, they have a good basketball team this year. They made it to the Sweet 16, it's called, which means they're in like the final 16 teams in the country. Last year, they actually made it to the Final 4. And they're fun games to watch. They're very high stakes. And I think that the Houston team next plays at Thursday at 9 p.m. So if you haven't checked out any of those games, you can check that one out. Have you started the third writing summit yet? That's good. There's 5 people who have. Happy to see that. Some people have sort of looked at it and a lot of people haven't started it. I think that's totally fine. If you haven't started it, there's, as I said earlier, it's 12 days till it's due. And then which of these research methods uses a manipulation of an independent variable? The answer was none of the above. So a lot of people put case study, which case study is just a research method where we observe like intensely one subject or a small group of subjects. There's no manipulation in case studies. You're just kind of, it's an observational research method. So you're intensely observing, again, like one person or a group of people. And oftentimes we do case studies if there's something like a particularly rare phenomenon that we want to understand better. So that's good. Let's get into chapter 9. So a few things, this is a little bit review still, but we're kind of in this chapter, again, we're going through like the various steps of the research process and things that you need to think about. And so one of the first steps is how are we going to get the sample of people who are going to participate in the study? And we talked about these terms in week 7, actually, in relation to surveys, but it really applies to any sort of research method where you have to get people from a population to participate in the sample. And how do we go about doing that? We can use what's called probability sampling, where each person in the population has a distinct probability of being included in the sample. And if we do that, there's different sort of subtypes of that, but in general, each of them, it enables you to know that like your sample is representative of the population. If we use non-probability sampling, one of the biggest sort of most common ways of sampling people is just called convenience samples, where we just get the first 100 people that we can find to take a survey. Like you don't actually know what was the specific probability that any individual from the population was going to be included. It was just sort of chance, like coincidence that you got the first 100 people you could, and probably those 100 people are going to differ from the full population in a bunch of different ways. So if we really want to like get a sample that accurately describes the population, we need to use probability sampling. And the simplest sort of way of doing probability sampling is called simple random sampling, or what you see here is just sort of random selection, like we're randomly selecting people from the population to participate in our study. And then with experiments, and this is the term true experiments where it comes in, is that we also would randomly assign people to a control group and a treatment group. And as a result of both of these sort of randomization things, like this treatment group and the control group should both be representative of this broader population and shouldn't differ from each other in any meaningful way. Another just general consideration to think about, and this is important for you as consumers of research, and any time that you see a study that you think is interesting or think it's sort of weird findings that you maybe are suspicious of, it's a good idea to look at the sample size of that study. So in general, like we can trust results from larger studies more than from really small studies. And the sample size is, just the number of people who participated in the study. In terms of a statistical point of view too, like the bigger sample size, the more power we have to detect statistically significant results. And so that's sort of built into all the various statistics that we use in psychology, that we know that if we have more people in, for example, the experimental group and the control group, that we can be more confident that if there are differences between those groups, that they're actually real differences and not just sort of random variation that we might expect if we had like only 4 people in each group, where of course the groups are going to differ because there's only 4 people. All right, so with experiments too, we've got our sample figured out, and then the next sort of thing that we're thinking about is how to manipulate the independent variable. So how to set up the experiment in such a way that we have a manipulation in the experimental group, and then the control group there doesn't have that manipulation or has a variation of it. Before we do that, we need to start with the informed consent form. So it's also important to kind of consider like what you are going to include in the informed consent form. Sometimes if you give away too much about a study, the participants might sort of change their behavior because they know what's being studied or they know the hypotheses, and they sort of alter their behavior in a way that helps the researchers find what they want to find, or it could be the opposite. You also want to set up like an experimental setting that is plausible for people. So what that could mean basically is like you set up a situation that's like similar to the real world and isn't like just totally detached from reality. Or it could just mean that like you have to make the experiment like accessible to people. So you don't want to have people drive 3 hours to go to some lab to take a study. You have to either, if it was something like that and people were from long distances, it should be available over the computer. And you just want to kind of make sure that people are set up in a way that they're not going to be distracted by random things in their physical environment. So then thinking about, again, like how exactly are we going to manipulate the independent variable? We'll talk about basically various considerations that have to do with the cost, practicality, and ethics of different sorts of manipulations, just as a general sort of overview of things to think about. Like, so say if I'm a researcher and I was interested in like, how much does the number of days in which you're absent each year affect your grade point average? And if I wanted to set up an experiment to do that, like it would probably be unethical really to have students miss any amount of days of school, but certainly I couldn't say like, all right, you are in the experimental group, you have to miss 30 days of school. That would not fly. So again, there's limits to sort of how much we can expect people to change their behavior from an ethical and sort of practical standpoint. So different types of manipulations. At the sort of most basic level, there's two main types I'll talk about. This first one is straightforward manipulations, where essentially it's just a straightforward, like we're altering the instructions in some sort of way or some like physical stimuli that's being changed, and the keyword being straightforward, like it's not a big thing to change. So the book talks about a study in which so it was an experiment where they wanted to see like what effect does the writing in hotels that say like help save the environment, conserve water, and like limit your towel use to only like as necessary. And so just phrasing that in different ways sort of alter people's behavior. And so what they found basically is that if the note only says help save the environment by doing blah, 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 versus if it says join your fellow guests in helping save the environment, people are more likely to sort of alter their behavior when it has this first part attached to it, like join your fellow guests, because then people are thinking, oh, other people are doing this too, and I want to be a good citizen. And that would be an example, yeah, of a straightforward manipulation where the independent variable here is just what's written on the sort of sign in a hotel room. And in one case, we just have something that says a little bit more than the other. So the second type of manipulation is called a staged manipulation. And you can think about this sort of stage as in like the stage of a play, like you're trying to set up stage some sort of real world situation, or you're trying to create like a psychological state in participants through some sort of real world situation. And so typically for these sorts of designs, we would like use what are called confederates, who are essentially, it's just a different word for like an actor who's going to pretend to be like not involved in the experiment, but they actually are. And oftentimes like they're sort of paid to act in a certain way. Or I went to grad school at University of Illinois. They did this sort of famous study where they were interested in like how people from different cultural backgrounds react to getting like getting bumped in the hallway, and they essentially paid a Confederate, so an actor, to like, so the participants were brought into this first experimental room and they were given like informed consent and stuff, and then they were told to walk to some other room, and there was a person in the hallway who was like doing some sort of like file drawer that like kind of blocked a lot of the hallway, and they would like do it right as the person walked by and bump into them. And like the researchers were interested in, again, like how different sorts of people responded to that. And so that's one example of like a sophisticated staged manipulation where we're trying to sort of really simulate the real world. We're going to watch another example of a staged manipulation in a video here, where this is sort of like a classic psychology study about the effects of conformity on people's behavior. And essentially, you'll see in the video, but people were asked to sort of compare the line length of different lines. And in most cases, like there was a super obvious right answer that anyone could sort of see if they had any sort of common sense, but they paid people to also sort of be doing the same task, but to report the wrong answer. And what the researchers were interested in is like, how likely are people to change their responses to what's obviously the wrong answer, strictly because of conformity. So let's watch this video here.
Okay, I want to give you a test of your visual acuity, your sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is, tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to agree with, to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases, you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white t-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2, 2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Asch found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1. They must be right.
There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1. This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. 2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2. 2. 2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1. 1. 2. 1. 2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with a group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1. 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
All right. So that's the overview of that. As I said, it's a very famous psychology study because it shows that people will say things that they blatantly know are wrong just because they don't want to sort of stand out. Another reason for showing that video is just to sort of start thinking about it. What you saw in that video was like a lot of different sort of variations of the manipulation, and in most cases what they were manipulating, was the degree of conformity in the actors or the confederates. So as a general rule, like it's cheap and easy to do straightforward manipulations, like the sort of like the example that I talked about in the hotel room, where you just would print out a different sign that said something slightly differently on it. If in that Ash experiment, they were only like manipulating the size of the lines, that would have been cheap. But to do the sort of the level of manipulation that they did, where it was a staged manipulation and lots of different variations of it, that costs a lot of money because they have to pay the actors. They had to spend time training them and rehearsing. So something to keep in mind when, again, planning different types of manipulations. Another related consideration is the strength of the manipulation. So what does that mean? The strength of manipulation? It's basically like so the amount of impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable is like the technical definition. What it kind of really means is like how different are the two groups in the different versions of the experiment, or if sometimes there's like 3 or more groups, and how much are you varying that independent variable across these groups? So that's how strong of a manipulation it is. Typically, like the rule that people say when planning studies is that you want to make the manipulation as strong as possible. So again, in an experiment like what we're interested in seeing the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And so we have different versions or different strengths of that independent variable. And we want to make sure that those levels of the independent variable differ enough that we can really detect a significant result on that dependent variable, excuse me. So let's just sort of we'll do a quick activity here, which you can just do independently. And I'll just ask, let's just focus on, let's say this first one for now. I'll just ask people to maybe type in the chat or turn on your microphone and say what you would think. But let's say I'm designing a study where I care about the effects of sleep duration. So that's the independent variable on test performance. So if I was going to manipulate sleep duration, and I wanted to do so, I wanted to have like 3 groups and that each group has a distinct level of sleep duration. Like how would I go about doing that, do you think? So I'll wait for a few more people to type in the chat. And again, what I kind of really want to know is like the strength of the manipulation to get people to sleep differently. And again, how we could set that up at like at least 3 distinct levels. So I think using melatonin could work. I think a lot of these responses are kind of, they would certainly affect sleep, but sleep would be more like the dependent variable. So if in terms of like melatonin or noise or caffeine, like that would be something that we could manipulate, and that would then be the independent variable. And then we'd be seeing how it affects sleep duration. And so kind of, I think the first answer was kind of the one I was sort of looking for. This other one, giving them, a set number of hours they're allowed to sleep. And then, so some are allowed to sleep 10 hours, some are allowed to sleep 8 hours, some 5, that would make sense. And then like, we're very certain that the only thing that we're manipulating is sleep duration, or at least how much time people are allowed to sleep. And we could see how that affected some dependent variable, like exam performance the next day. With lighting in the room, it could be, the same sort of idea. Let's say we wanted to see how lighting affected people's test performance. You could set up like 3 different levels of lighting, and obviously you'd want to have like, all of them should be bright enough that people can like at least see what they're doing in some sort of way. There are these other sort of manipulations where we could manipulate like the physical attractiveness of other people in a group or the rudeness of other people. So you might think about like that Ash conformity experiment where they might say they wanted to know like to what extent does physical attractiveness of other people in a room like affect conformity, so they could hold steady the amount of conformity in terms of like everyone's going to say the same answer across groups in terms of those Confederates, but in some of the groups they would have Confederates be very attractive and in other groups not so much. I think that would potentially raise some ethical concerns in terms of like having to have people be rated as part of their as their physical attractiveness, but that's the sort of general idea. And again, I just kind of put the slide in here just to kind of get you to think about like, there's a lot of different considerations when you're manipulating an independent variable. And I think what's most important is that you want to make sure that you're only manipulating that independent variable and you're studying its effect on something else, and you're not letting in sort of other variables that might change the results. And yeah, oftentimes like sleep studies are done in labs where they measure the time people are spent sleeping like physiologically, so they can control for exactly how much people are sleeping. Harley asked, back to the previous slide. So this was the previous slide about the strength of manipulation. And actually I had it again on the next slide, because the two things I just to sort of summarize the things we just talked about, like, so you do want to have, yeah, a strong manipulation that clearly differentiates the level of the independent variable between groups, but like truly to do the strongest possible manipulation, that might not really be realistic at all. So in terms of like lighting in a room, you can't have like the one group have like zero light. Otherwise, I mean, no one's going to ever be asked to take a test in a completely dark room. And then, yeah, there's certainly ethical considerations. So if sleep studies, there is a lot of research on like sleep, the effects of sleep, and some of it is experimental, where they do manipulate how much sleep people are allowed to get. And yeah, that sort of research it's very sort of tricky to get by like an institutional review board, because if we know definitively that like people who sleep less are like more likely to get into car accidents and just kind of like have more trouble regulating their attention. And so to set up an experiment like that, you would need to like really think through like, how are participants getting to the lab? Do they have time like after the experiment to catch up on sleep? Bunch of things like that. And you wouldn't ever be able to limit a group to have like zero sleep or something that would be potentially harmful physically or mentally. Okay, so we're at break time. I think let's take a 5-minute break today. So if you could be back at 12:23, we'll get started again then. So we have about 10 slides of content left, and we're probably not going to get through all of it. We have like 25 minutes of class time left. I also have a video to show. So I'll say we'll get through like 5 slides, and then we'll show the video, and then that will probably be the end of class. We're still kind of moving through this experimental design process and thinking about, again, like various considerations, or how are we going to set up the experiment, get participants, how are we going to manipulate the independent variable, and how strong of a manipulation is going to be. Another really important thing to think about is how are we going to measure our variables. In this case, like focusing on the dependent variable or the outcome variable, there's different sort of ways of measuring that. And we'll talk about 3 main types, one of which is self-reports, another is behavioral measures, and then the third would be physiological measures. But I'll talk about each of them next here. But self-reports is the most common and most sort of widely used. We've talked about with survey research. I mean, survey research is almost exclusively self-report. You can also set up surveys where like you report, it's like a other report. So like a close friend or colleague could be reporting about your personality. But typically, yeah, surveys anyway are self-reports, and we use these descriptive anchors. They're sometimes called Likert scales, where you have to respond to a statement, whether or not you strongly disagree or strongly agree. And then each of the sort of midpoints also typically has a label, like the 3 is typically a neutral, like neither disagree nor agree. And with self-reports, like the biggest sort of limitation is that we're relying on people to accurately describe themselves, and people don't always do that. people sometimes don't have all the information needed to really evaluate themselves. But in some cases, like self-report's the best that you can do, because if you want to know something about like someone's depressive symptoms, typically, I mean, the best person to ask is going to be themselves. A lot of, again, like things that we measure in psychology are not observable to outsiders. And so we have to sort of rely on people to reliably self-report. The second main type of measures are behavioral. So that would be, we're no longer going to just rely on how someone like self-reports, but we're also going to kind of observe them and see how they actually behave. So these tend to be in general sort of more objective, but you are sort of more limited in terms of you have to sort of be able to observe behaviors that are observable. So that could be like physical behaviors or what people say. If you were studying like aggression in young kids, like you could record. So you're trying to typically sort of quantify behaviors. And so typically like in terms of quantifying something like aggression among kids, like you could say like the rate, the number of times in which they said like something mean to another student, and then how long did those interactions occur? So that could be like the rate and duration. Reaction time is another sort of behavior that we're often interested in, especially with like cognitive sort of tasks, like how long does it take someone to complete this puzzle or something like that. And again, these are all things that we can actually observe and can be quantified. Sometimes, and this is like especially relevant for like consumer research, there's, I mean, companies and then there's like consumer psychology and marketing and advertising. There's a ton of research on like what affects people's buying, like purchasing behaviors. And so if we think about like, I mean, you can do a ton of stuff that is technically a behavior that doesn't actually like involve anything other than like clicking around your computer. And so behavioral measures can also include like, what are people purchasing online? What other sort of choices are they making? There's also eye tracking research where some of you maybe even have done this. I think I once participated in an eye tracking study where you put on this sort of like headset and then it tracks like where your eyes are looking on a screen. And so it's an actual like measure of what people are paying attention to and for how long. And again, that's often used for like website design and things like that, where we want to know like what attracts people's attention, and from companies' perspective, like how can we get people to spend more on stuff they don't need. So the third main type of measures here are called physiological measures, and physiological kind of just means like something related to the physical body. So there are various things that we can record about people's bodies that say something about like what's going on mentally or emotionally or that relate to like stress and anxiety levels. So there's galvanic skin response, which is GSR is the acronym. So that measures the actual electrical conductance of people's skin. And that can kind of be a signal to like how much emotional arousal someone is experiencing, or whether or not they're experiencing like anxiety. There's electromyograms, which are, they measure the electrical activity of muscles. So typically sort of like when we're stressed out or tense, like our muscles are more tense. And so that's another way of sort of measuring like physiologically how stressed is someone, which could be used to like supplement like a self-report measure of stress or anxiety. There's two main types of MRI measures. There's just like the basic MRI, which is useful for sort of scanning the structures of especially like soft tissues in the body. So if you ever had like an injury to your knee or ankle or shoulders or anything like that, you may have gotten an MRI to see like if there's any torn ligaments. But it's also useful for scanning the brain and seeing kind of how the brain is structured. Typically, like an MRI doesn't really, just a basic MRI doesn't say anything about like the activity that's going on in one's brain. And so an fMRI actually measures blood flow to different areas of the brain. So in psychology research, researchers like set up experiments or where people go into an fMRI machine and they're asked to do different things. And then they see like which areas of the brain are lighting up and that there's increased blood flow when they're asked to do different things. So it can give sort of a signal of which areas of the brain are used for different cognitive tasks or when people are experiencing different sorts of emotions and things like that. And then lastly, an EEG is what you see here in this image. But an EEG is kind of like you put these electrodes all over your skull and it measures the electrical activity in your brain, which can say like kind of, yeah, how much is your, like, how much brain arousal are you experiencing and how do you respond to different situations? It's a lot less precise than an fMRI. It's just kind of saying like how much arousal is there in general. But it can be more useful for that purpose. And I think maybe the most important point about thinking about measures is that like any single variable can be measured in multiple ways. You can just think about it like in terms of like we have 5 senses or 5 main senses anyway that we use to sense the external world, and you can see an object, you can hear an object, you can smell an object, touch or taste, and all of these are like describing the same thing, but they're doing so in different ways. And so it's the same sort of idea that would be applied to measuring something like depression or anxiety, and that we can measure it with self-report, we can measure it through behaviors, we can measure aspects of it in terms of like actual body physiological responses. Even in terms of like any given method, like if we use self-report to measure depression, there's a bunch of different questions that we can ask that would be related to depression. And so researchers kind of just have to kind of come to a consensus about this is how we're defining depression, and ultimately these are the items that we're choosing to measure it, and to ensure that sort of things are replicable across studies. Researchers tend to use the same measures of depression. It's also can be really useful to know whether, like, if we're really trying to see that if one variable causes other variables, so the independent variable is actually having a causal effect, we might want to make sure that like we're measuring the dependent variable in multiple different ways, and we want to see the same sort of effect regardless of how we measure the dependent variable. So if we're manipulating sleep duration and we want to see how that affects people's energy levels the next day, we can measure energy levels through self-report and some sort of physiological measure. And we also, sometimes as a researcher, you're interested in seeing how one independent variable affects several different behaviors. And so in that case, let's say I'm interested in sleep duration again, and if I manipulate it, like how does that affect people's test scores, their internship performance, and their satisfaction with major? And there we can see like kind of if one sort of variable is more closely related to sleep than others. So an important consideration when we are thinking about how to measure dependent variables is this idea of sensitivity. So sensitivity is basically just like, are we really able to detect differences between people or between groups because our measures are like finely tuned enough that they're able to discriminate between people who have different levels of that variable? There's two effects here that would be indications of like when a measure is not sensitive enough. So the The ceiling effect is basically a problem where the independent variable appears to have no effect on the dependent variable because essentially like participants are too quickly reaching the maximum performance level. And so to kind of explain what that means in different words, oftentimes it's a problem if like the test is too easy. So like it's not discriminating between people and everyone is getting 100%. So again, if it was sleep duration and we wanted to see if people who get less sleep perform worse on a test, but the test is so easy that everyone is getting 100%, that's the ceiling effect. Like there's no way of the people who actually are more rested, like they probably would do better, but the test isn't sensitive enough. It's getting kind of stuck at a ceiling point. And the floor effect is basically the same problem, but just like the opposite. So the test it's the same problem of like the test is not discriminating enough between people. It's not sensitive, but this case it's because it's too hard. So no one can kind of get off the floor. So even though like, again, the group that's more rested would probably do better, no one is getting any questions right on the test because it's too difficult. So this is part of the reason why these ceiling effects and floor effects is a main reason why like it's really important to pilot test measures. So have people take it before you actually go live with the study, just to make sure that the measures are actually capturing variability between people. And then a final consideration is cost. So there are vast differences in terms of the cost of different sorts of measures. Self-report tends to be really cheap. Sometimes you do have to pay people to take surveys in order to get enough, but you don't have to pay them that much. Whereas like running a single participant through an fMRI study costs like several $1,000s. And so if you're talking about a study where you have 100 people go through an fMRI machine, you're talking about like $100,000 or more. And that very quickly sort of adds up. So to do fMRI research, typically you need like resources from a grant. And so like the University of Houston sometimes will supply research or funding for researchers like internally, but the federal grants is where like the big money sort of happens. And so the University of Houston, for example, like they want as many professors to get grants as possible because then they get some of that money and it just sort of helps everything run more efficiently and also helps like in that you're doing the research at University of Houston, it helps the university sort of prestige and rankings, things like that. So I have two more slides here and one of them we'll watch a video on. So another important consideration when planning a study is like, what are participants going to think about when they're going through it? And this is what I said when like in terms of the informed consent process, that sometimes you don't want to say everything, like tell the participant exactly what's being studied, because if they know what's being studied, they might sort of change their behavior in such a way that confirms it or the opposite. So this term demand characteristics basically just means that it's any feature of an experiment that could inform participants about the purpose of a study. So that could be a demand characteristic, could be found in the informed consent form. Could just be like whatever sort of procedures are going through, like kind of give away what's being studied. And so if I was setting up a study about political orientation and homophobia, and all of the questions on the survey that I put together were about these two things, like participants might figure that out and they might in some sort of way alter their responses. So deception is kind of the main way to sort of mitigate these sort of participant expectations, or to prevent. Mitigate just means prevent, like participant expectations from altering the study in some way that's we don't want. So one way of using deception is what's called filler items. So if, again, I was setting up a study about political orientation and homophobia, and that was the only things I put on the survey, probably most participants would know what the survey was about in a general sense. And so I could get around that by just kind of including a bunch of other stuff on the survey that I wasn't really necessarily interested in, but at least like it disguised what I'm focusing on in particular. So I'd still have the same questions about political orientation and homophobia, but I would also have like a bunch of other questions. And so they would sort of stand out less. Another really important form of these participant expectations sort of influencing results in a way that we don't really want is what's called the placebo effect. And basically the placebo effect is like a general term for like situations in which people like the kind of expectation that they'll get better is actually makes them get better. And the treatment itself doesn't really do anything, but it's just sort of like there to get people's expectations like working. And so we'll watch this video here about the placebo effect. I think it's a super fascinating phenomenon that happens.
In 1996, 56 volunteers took part in a study to test a new painkiller called trivaricaine. On each subject, one index finger was covered in the new painkiller, while the other remained untouched. Then, both were squeezed in painful clamps. The subjects reported that the treated finger hurt less than the untreated one. This shouldn't be surprising, except trivaricaine wasn't actually a painkiller, just a fake concoction with no pain-easing properties at all. What made the students so sure this dummy drug had worked? The answer lies in the placebo effect, an unexplained phenomenon wherein drugs, treatments, and therapies that aren't supposed to have an effect and are often fake miraculously make people feel better. Doctors have used the term placebo since the 1700s, when they realized the power of fake drugs to improve people's symptoms. These were administered when proper drugs weren't available, or if someone imagined they were ill. In fact, the word placebo means "I shall please" in Latin, hinting at a history of placating troubled patients. Placebos had to mimic the real treatments in order to be convincing, so they took the form of sugar pills, water-filled injections, and even sham surgeries. Soon, doctors realized that duping people in this way had another use: in clinical trials. By the 1950s, researchers were using placebos as a standard tool to test new treatments. To evaluate a new drug, for instance, half the patients in a trial might receive the real pill. The other half would get a placebo that looked the same. Since patients wouldn't know whether they'd received the real thing or a dud, the results wouldn't be biased, researchers believed. Then, if the new drug showed a significant benefit compared to the placebo, it was proved effective. Nowadays, it's less common to use placebos this way because of ethical concerns. If it's possible to compare a new drug against an older version or another existing drug, that's preferable to simply giving someone no treatment at all, especially if they have a serious ailment. In these cases, placebos are often used as a control to fine-tune the trial, so that the effects of the new versus the old or alternative drug can be precisely compared. But of course, we know that placebos exert their own influence too. Thanks to the placebo effect, patients have experienced relief from a range of ailments, including heart problems, asthma, and severe pain, even though all they'd received was a fake drug or sham surgery. We're still trying to understand how. Some believe that instead of being real, the placebo effect is merely confused with other factors, like patients trying to please doctors by falsely reporting improvements. On the other hand, researchers think that if a person believes a fake treatment is real, their expectations of recovery actually do trigger physiological factors that improve their symptoms. Placebos seem to be capable of causing measurable change in blood pressure, heart rate, and the release of pain-reducing chemicals like endorphins. That explains why subjects in pain studies often say placebos ease their discomfort. Placebos may even reduce levels of stress hormones like adrenaline, which can slow the harmful effects of an ailment. So shouldn't we celebrate the placebo's bizarre benefits? Not necessarily. If somebody believes a fake treatment has cured them, they may miss out on drugs or therapies that are proven to work. Plus, the positive effects may fade over time, and often do. Placebos also cloud clinical results, making scientists even more motivated to discover how they wield such power over us. Despite everything we know about the human body, there are still some strange and enduring mysteries, like the placebo effect. So what other undiscovered...
All right, so as I said, I think the placebo effect is a very interesting thing that happens, and it partly kind of like gets at like the power of hope and expecting to get better, and that alone can sometimes make people actually feel better. But it's super important to think about in any sort of like experiment where there's a treatment that's being designed. So oftentimes for drug, if you're trying to see whether or not a new drug works, it's not just enough to have a control group of people who are not taking any drug, but because of this placebo effect group, like we need a group of people who are taking a drug, a hypothetical drug, and it's not a real drug, it's just like a sugar pill or something. And then we want to see that the placebo group, so it's kind of like a control group, but again, they're taking some fake drug. If they improve as much as the actual experimental group taking the real drug, then probably like this improvement is just due to that placebo effect. On the other hand, if the experimental group does do better than the placebo group, then that would be a good sign that there's something about that drug that's actually working. I guess this was kind of covered in the video, but there's certainly an ethical implication that if we know that there is some sort of effective treatment for a specific type of cancer or anything really, and like giving people a placebo, it would be unethical. So sometimes if they're trying to kind of develop a new treatment, they might give a placebo for 8 weeks and then do the treatment, something like that, so that everyone ultimately gets the actual treatment at some point. That is everything that I want to cover for today. So I will post a recording. There's really only like 5 slides left for week 9. So I'll post that recording to Blackboard. Let me know if there are any questions about anything. Otherwise, hope everyone has a good week, and I'll see you next Tuesday.
Bye. Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you.